Thank you very much. Again, I'm Jim Felsberg with Sun Chemical. And maybe before I get into my presentation, a little bit about who Sun Chemical is. We are the world's largest producer of printing inks. They like Sun Chemical, I guess, right? So that's who Sun Chemical is. So everything today that I'm going to present is really from a printing ink point of view. So I just want to lay that out there so you understand that. So when we talk about locking in on color targets, color obviously is important and the consistency of color is important. And there's targets we have to hit to achieve that consistency. Whether we print with line color or expanded gamut color, we have to hit the color. So what we're going to review today is some work we've done at Sun Chemical that reviews the different variables of color and what has to be controlled to be able to hit consistent color targets. So again, Sun Chemical and ink makers' view of printing of expanded gamut. And if you want me to stop and slow down on 7 color, let me know. I can explain in more details. But when we print expanded gamut, we print with 7 colors. The standard 4, yellow, magenta, cyan, and black. And we add typically an orange, we add a green, and we add a purple. There's some debate about what those colors should be, and we'll talk about that in a little bit further on. And then those colors are either printed single or overlaid to build the brand color or the Pantone color. So if you got to build a Pantone 185, you trap the colors and you make that Pantone 185 by putting yellow over red over orange, for example. So that's what expanded gamut printing is about in 30 seconds. So a little bit more about expanded gamut as far as tooling. The concept is the inks go in the press with a certain set of analoxes. The inks don't change, so every job we print the same inks, and the graphics change to get the image different. So we change the plates in Flexo, and we get the different image with expanded gamut. Make sense? So the real benefits are color matching goes away because we're printing the same 7 colors over and over and over. We don't typically run to color, but we run to density, and we measure the dot gain. If you guys know what dot gain is how big the dot is. And the real benefit to the printer and the end user is the quicker changeover time. Because we're not color matching, because we're not changing the inks, the changeover from job to job is faster. The other benefit is because all 7 colors are the same, you can have all different designs on one web, depending on the width of the web. So in a wide web press, you can have a cherry flavor, a Dr. Pepper flavor, whatever flavor you want, just all the different flavors across a web, because all the 7 colors are the same. It's just how you trap them to get that image. So again, the benefits are really about the quicker changeover time, increased press efficiency. Sorry. Again, changeover time, no color matching time. It really goes away because all the color matching time is pre-press. And lastly, typically they go hand in hand with faster press speeds, and I can explain that a little bit more. So one other thing, before I get into the data, and there's a lot of data I'm going to present. Some might say too much data. You have to really, the term expanded gamut might be somewhat of a misnomer. It's expanded gamut versus 4-color process printing. But it's somewhat, for lack of a better term, reduced gamut versus line color. So on the chart on the right, that's a typical gamut that we might get. And by gamut, I mean the color space available for the print is the gamut. On the right is what we can hit with line colors. There's about 12 different colors that make up that color space on the right. On the left is what we can get with 7 colors. So expanded gamut is somewhat of a misnomer because it's a smaller gamut versus line color. So just realize that as we go into color targets and color standards, the gamut is somewhat reduced. So we talk, again, the focus of this discussion now, we've kind of learned about expanded gamut, what it's about, but the real focus of this is if we have a color target, what matters to that color target? What impacts it? Is it substrate? So in packaging, which is the group I'm in, there's all kinds of different substrates. We reverse print, we surface print, we have opaque substrates, we back up with white, we do all those different things. How does that affect color? how is the measurements taken? What are we reading it over? Does that impact color? And lastly, every process has variation. What kind of variation? So when we set up a color target, what kind of variation can we expect to see that might impact the tightness of the color tolerances? So again, on the substrate specifically, how does substrate affect color? So we can look at color by density, we can look at color by LAB, and we look at color by hue, and we'll talk through that in a little bit. And we picked 3 substrates to look at. We looked at white polyethylene, a white film, an opaque film. We looked at reverse print on polypropylene, which is a clear film, and then we took that same print and we put some white behind it. And we said, if we change those substrates, how does that affect the color? Can we use the same color targets? So before I go into that, a little bit about definition. LAB, right? As you look at color space, that's just a point in space that identifies the color. Color is a finite space, and we can actually track where the color stands with an LAB number. Hue is really the color itself. And then we'll talk about different backings. For example, Munsell is a type of backing. And again, a lot of terms, if I'm flying over the terms, please let me know. I'll answer in more detail. But for example, polyethylene, PE. So you'll see that on a lot of the charts as we go forward.
Do you make these yourself?
So like I said, now we're going to get into a lot of data. I'm not going to go through the data in a lot of detail, but really just looking at the trends and what we saw. So in this chart, I'm going to use the mouse to point out some different things if the mouse is there. There it is. So in this case, we looked at a blue process ink, we looked at an opaque polyethylene, clear film, and we take the clear film and we backed it by white. Backed by white, BBW, got it? And we looked at it in different 100%, 75, and the mouse is gone, in different tonal ranges, and we looked at the LAB, the LCH, and the density. And one thing you'll clearly see is, as we change the substrate from opaque film to clear film to backed by white, the density changes. We looked at the LAB, that changes. We looked at the hue, that changes. So clearly, when we look at the process inks and we change the structure, if we have one color target, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have to dial in the color targets for the substrate. We said, well, is that a blue issue or is it all the colors? So we did the same study with the other colors. I've got the red data here. We see the same thing. The density changes, the LAB changes, and the hue changes. So the substrates change, and if we have one set of color targets, we have to have a separate color target if the substrate changes. A very common issue in packaging is substrate changes all the time, from one job to the next. To have one set of color standards, this study doesn't support that we can do that and still hit targets. So again, if the substrate changes, we got 2 choices. We modify the ink to hit those targets, or we set up a different standard for the different substrate. And that's what's most commonly done. We have different standards depending on the structure. This really supports that needs to be done. So the second thing we looked at is when you read a color, and I'm sure most of you in this room have done it, you take a spectro, you pop it down, and there's a print. Under the print, there's a backing. There's a couple different backings that are very commonly used. We use something called a Munsell chart, a Bico chart, and then we see a lot of our customers will just take some paper that's laying around and throw it under there. So we looked at the same study. Does that make a difference in color? If we have a color target, if we don't control the backing under the print, does that make a difference? The short answer is minimal difference. The density stays the same, and again, what we looked at here is a yellow process ink. We looked at opaque film with 3 different backings. Doesn't seem to make much difference. Now you might say that's an opaque film, so we'll get to that. But if you look at the LAB, we looked at the density, and we looked at the hue, they stay relatively the same with an opaque film. But we took that same yellow and we put it on a clear film, and this is reverse print on clear polypropylene on the clear film. And we did the same thing. And the density changes a little bit, not a lot. The LAB changes a little bit, but not a lot, not nearly as much as we saw with on the first piece with the different films. And then the hue also changes a little bit. So although the backing should be controlled, before I go into that, we also looked at a purple ink, a processed purple. We looked at the same thing, density, LAB, and hue. And again, very minimal difference if we look at the backing. So although we would recommend that the backing be controlled, the backing behind the prints that are being measured does not seem to have a large impact on the color target. So if you're going to miss on anything, the backing doesn't seem to be as critical as the film. So the next piece of data we looked at was variation in the prints. So every process has some variation, and we see this a lot in wide web flexo, even some medium web width flexo, is that there's variation. If you do measurements across the web, we see there's differences. So we took a lab environment and we tried to control everything. We control the analox, and the analox is about that wide, so it's very consistent, there's no deflection. We looked at the proofing method. We used an automatic proofer with pressure and speed. In the lab environment, we control the viscosity as tight as we can. We made them very quick so the viscosity didn't have a chance to change. We have one operator, one technician, and we were in a nice air-conditioned, humidity-controlled environment in the lab. And we looked at the variation. How much variation do we see in flexo, even in this controlled, ideal environment? And the answer is quite a bit. So if even the same technician making the same proof, doing it over and over again, we're getting a DE of up to 0.4 to 0.5. So again, when you set your color targets, you have to understand that there's going to be variation. If you set a color target within 0.5 and the variation is more than your standard, there's no way you'll ever be able to meet them. So as we look at different color targets and we look at magenta, yellow, orange, green, and purple, the variation's all similar, about a half a DE unit just in the proofing and in the methodology of applying the ink. So as you look at your color target, if you have a very tight color tolerance, you have to understand that there's variation in the beginning. So the last piece that we looked at, the last piece of data that we looked at is monopigmented inks versus multi-pigmented inks. And so what does that mean? All the data I presented so far, whether it's yellow, magenta, cyan, black, whatever color we looked at, had one pigment in it. Green had green pigment, obviously, orange had orange pigment, and so forth. We also, for a lot of different reasons, will match color. So we'll make an orange with red and yellow. We'll make a green with blue and yellow. So we will match colors with multi-pigment. So we also did the same piece of research to say, hey, if we use multi-pigment processings versus monopigment processings, how does that affect our color standards? So more data. If we look at them by themselves and we look at the variation of, on the top, a monopigmented orange versus a matched orange has more than one pigment, when we look at the colors by themselves, there's not a lot of variation in the difference. So orange, green, again, a little bit more variation in multi, but very close. And purple, same thing, a little bit more variation, but they're very similar. But remember when we talked about before with 7-color process printing, we trap colors to build them. And the question is, if we have single pigmented process inks versus multi-pigmented process inks, when we trap them, what kind of variation do we see? And we see a lot more. So when you're setting your color targets, you have to understand if the inks are single pigmented or multi-pigmented. Because when we look at multi-pigmented process inks, the variation goes up dramatically. And we see that in practice. So it was kind of a good validation what we see in practice. And you can see this is, on the top is straight magenta over a monopigmented orange. On the bottom is that same magenta over a multi-pigmented orange. And the variation to the target goes up dramatically. And we see the same thing in green if we make a multi-pigmented green. And we see the same thing in purple if we make a multi-pigmented purple. So if you're looking to lock in your color targets, make sure you know if it's monopigmented or multi-pigmented, and your ink room or your ink manufacturer will be able to tell you that. It's pretty basic. So again, this piece, without a doubt, these monopigmented inks are more consistent than multi-pigmented process inks when we trap them. And really the conclusion is expanded gamut offers our customers, our printers, the end users, a wide variety of colors to achieve. but you have to be real critical to get your color targets right. And whether that's variation, the pigment type, the substrate, or the backing, that all needs to be controlled to minimize any variation. And that's it.